Hello and welcome to the first of a series of journalism trainings focused on child well-being, sponsored by the National Press Foundation and supported by the Packard Foundation, Heising-Simons Foundation, and the Kellogg Foundation. We have gathered in McAllen, Texas this evening. The 15 journalists who are participating in this fellowship will spend the next few days focusing on some of the major issues and challenges for American children. In this opening keynote session, we're going to be thinking about one of the most troubling reasons, I guess, that children in America make headlines. And that is when it comes to trauma, when it comes to violence, when it comes to a serious crisis that has been occurring in American schools over the past few decades. Our keynote speaker is a legend in journalistic circles. Manny García has worked for ProPublica, for El Nuevo Herald, for the Miami Herald, for Gannett, organizations all over this country. But in recent months and in the past year, Manny was at the helm of the Austin American-Stateman newspaper when news broke that there had been a shooting in Uvalde, Texas. He was tasked with sending journalists to the front lines of that crisis, that tragic event, and some of the lessons and some of the experiences that he had in assigning stories, in supporting journalists, and helping the community understand some of the very difficult journalistic decisions that he had to make are things that I think we can all learn from when it comes to thinking about the future of American children and what they face. So, Manny, welcome to this session.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to start, before I let you take it away and really tell us what you want us to know about this topic, but I'd like to take us back to where you and I sort of have some common ground. A couple of decades ago, when the definition of the children's beat and what that meant. So what do you recall the children's beat meaning when you started out as a journalist?
Well, first of all, as I've met some of you already, I just want to once again say congratulations that you're here. This is a great opportunity to break away for 3 days and just concentrate on yourselves, on the journalism, and really getting to meet each other and use yourselves as a great support network, because what you're building here should extend beyond here and going forward. So when I started, really the education beat was more, children's beat was covering K through 12. So it was schools, covering schools. You would have, if you had some coverage of children, as I remember it, it would normally be through a horrific crime. A child killed, parachuting journalism, dive in, do a takeout, move on. You may get a trial covered. But it was K through 12, and the work was important, covering a lot of meetings. But I'd say you fast forward now, and the dynamic has really changed. And I'll talk about Uvalde, but the greater lesson, one thing I want to share with you is that when you're covering children, you need to look at it differently. You're covering the future. So in essence, what's my job? What's your beat? I have a futures beat. It's the future. So you may be covering a student now in elementary school, middle school, but what you're writing about them, what policies are taking place, what's impacting them, you have to start looking at it, and you're reporting with a much longer lenses. Because what happens today will impact their lives going forward. So bring that, I like to say, as I've shared with many of you, what's important for readers is context. Context. I'll give you an example. When I was at ProPublica, there's an extraordinary immigration writer that I hired from the Houston Chronicle, Loemi Creel. So she was writing about deportations, the whole Title 42 and the deportation of children, we were fortunate enough to connect with a adolescent psychiatrist. So what she described is the forced, say, repatriation back to our home country, where a child, young teen, or just was forced back into where they had fled, and the family separation. Just think about the trauma that that creates. And maybe many of us have access to therapy and help. These young kids don't. So what the adolescent psychiatrist said, what's happened now, we're going to see the impact of it in 5 and 10 years down the line, 15. So consider this coverage, what you're learning here, like a futures beat, how the policies, the decisions, what happens today impacts the future.
As we talked at lunch about what it is that journalism needs to do to support communities, support children, one of the things you said that resonated with me the most was we need to be bringing people hope. We need to somehow be producing content that doesn't evoke fear and doesn't evoke panic. What did you mean by that?
Well, we've talked about this. You open a faucet and it's just like so much news coming in, negative news, disinformation. And it's just, so our roles, the great job that you all have is you have the ability to cut through that noise and bring, I use the word context a lot, because context and clarity. And there's a real hunger for that, and that context and clarity, that turns into trust, which really results in ratings and trust and growth. Also, if you're in the business of driving subscriptions, people are looking for a trusted source of accurate news in context. So by hope I go to, for instance, families are busy if you have children and they're trying to, what is working? There's so much coming down on them. What is working in schools? What are best practices that are working? What can I do as a parent as I'm working 2 jobs, or I'm working and I'm worried about paying bills? So as a parent, what is working for parents? What are other parents doing that could be modeled? What is working in schools? What is the best practices that you can go back to your district or somebody says, what's actually working that you can show now has had an effect where it's spreading? What's working in schools? And above all, getting with students themselves, it's always going to be, and through the discussions with students, what are you happy about? What's working for you, and where do you see? Because that's the hope. It's the public service of saying, we're going to help you navigate this very difficult time.
But how do you juxtapose that with the definition of news, or what is newsworthy? For example, we've been seeing over the past few days about the 6-year-old child who shot his teacher. Or a few months back, we saw about the 11-year-old boy who shot his mother because she wouldn't buy him a PlayStation. So it seems to me that many of us, and certainly in our generation, we were taught that news was man bites dog. So it has to be something that is so unusual that it makes the headlines. So how do you juxtapose what you just said with the fact that there still very much is that perception?
I'll give you a twofold answer. So there's that, yes, if you've got an elementary school student, a 6-year-old shoots the teacher, you've got to report that. I mean, that's extraordinary and unusual. How did this happen? How did the child get the gun? What was the dynamic and the situation behind it? And how safe is the school? How did he get a gun into the school? Do they have metal detectors? Again, going back to families, how safe is my child? So going back to what I mentioned before, how safe is my child? How safe is the school? What can I do as a parent? So those are important stories, but you can look at it through a different lens. In the majority of cases, there's not shooting in schools, but you want to be able to bring that perspective and balance it out. You have to tell those stories. Listen, when I started 30 years ago, there was a 12-year-old, maybe younger, who walked up to a guy in a phone booth and shot him in the head just because he wanted to see what it was like to see somebody die. So we covered that. Years later, I covered a teenager who saw the movie Menace to Society, and he wanted to see what it was like to kill people. And he 16 years old, he executed people in a grocery store. And so those things make news, but then it's what's behind the scenes. So if you have the time and you have the luxury and you have the support from the editors, look for those stories that go beyond, because you have to think of breaking news like waves on the beach. They're always going to come, then they roll out. That's the news cycle. It rolls in, and then it rolls out. Rolls in, rolls out. You're staying on the beach. And for those nuggets that are left on there, those shells, that's my story when everybody else is gone. So find those stories.
One of the things we talked about in one of our sessions, our first session tomorrow, is about the historic vote in New Mexico to fund early child care for most people. It's the first state in the nation to ever do that. Why don't we see headlines like that on the front page of the New York Times?
Well, I think if you had a headline, so it's maybe that, I can't speak for the Times, but I can speak it like our two education reporters. If they come to us and says, there's going to be this investment in funding, we're going to dedicate time and resources to that because that's a major win. Suddenly you're going to be investing in children. Again, what I talked about, the future. You're pouring resources now and investment in the future. I think they do make headlines, and I think they do well. Part of what we talked about, this, a muscle memory that we have is like, you're right, man bites, dog bites man, or man bites dog. It's that we know instinctively how to jump on a tragedy in a story, but it's having the discipline, which I know we all have in this room, to say, I may have to do that story, but I'm not going to be guided or deflected where I can focus on a bigger picture story. I say that knowing that as a former beat reporter, how do I get my editor who wants, you need to stay on this, look what the competition is doing. So formulate why there's a much bigger story here to be told through what I call is left in your notebook, but that New Mexico story, that's hugely important.
Let's now talk about the day that news came to the newsroom that there was a shooting in Uvalde. You're a parent, and you also, did you not cover the Pulse nightclub? So you had experience with these kinds of dramatic, tragic situations, but you hear it's an elementary school. Take us to that day and take us to some of the decisions that you had to make as an editor in terms of coverage.
We've got to get reporters moving. And above all, visual journalists. I don't say this as a criticism as a narrative storyteller, as a print journalist, but there is a power in visuals that is very hard to match by words. So we sent a group of reporters. And
how many?
Initially, I wanted to say 3 to 5. There's Tony, Nicole Foy. I think about 5 we sent. And as we're driving, we're realizing, well, there's injuries, then a couple of fatalities, then more fatalities. And then we're hearing that it's 15 to 20. So keep in mind, we have a reporter back at the office and we're taking feeds and we're writing as people are driving. So the people who are driving is like, just get down there. We'll cover this based on reporting that we can do while driving. We have sources at the Department of Public Safety here in Austin, and just so we launch people. We get at that point says, well, we know we have more than a dozen, 21 dead. So there's one advantage that we have. We're part of the USA Today network. So we become the point for USA Today on our reporting. Reporters come in from the Arizona Republic to help us, and from other parts, USA Today sends a team of people. So we just flood the zone, and part of the job of editors and part of the job you have too is, remember, in those moments, I try to teach this. In a moment of dire crisis like this, when everything's blowing up, always find a moment in your reporting, step away, take a deep breath, and size up what you have. Look at your notes, but above all, find time to walk off. See what you have quiet. Find yourself a quiet spot. What do you have? What do you feel you need? What's being asked of you? But above all, find yourself some quiet time. Always keep a pack in your car. Always keep gear, what I call go gear, which includes many bottles of water, a phone charger, notebooks, and snack bars. So we realize we have this major catastrophe, and we've got to report on it. And understanding that many in our newsroom, there's only been really two of us who've covered a mass shooting before. I've covered, and Tony Blahetsky, our investigative reporter. So knowing that the impact is going to be what it is, our photo department makes a brilliant call. Nell Carroll, who's retired now, and Brianna Sanchez, who we hired out of El Paso, she's now our visuals director, is to rotate people in. 1 day or 2 days in and out, because of it's way too much. And then the national media, everybody's on there, so there's almost no space. And you've got, every time a family or somebody who looked distraught, somebody walked out, everybody on them. Now, I don't say that as a criticism against TV at all. Everybody's trying to get to the story. So regardless of when you all of you are parachuted into these type of major traumatic events, always keep in mind trying to, at some point, what the cause was. Cause, how could it have been prevented? Prevention and cause. Why did it happen? So there's always going to be that.
The horror, though, of, again, any death in that manner is horrific, and
let's go back to children.
But we're talking about children. So when you were speaking with or interacting or hearing about how your journalists were doing in that moment, was there an extra measure of complexity that you had to deal with?
The complexity had to be about the pull to do the reporting aggressively and rigorously versus not causing more pain and harm to families and children. There was a lot of children there who were witnesses. And how do you approach a child when we're like, that's, in many ways, no, unless the parent's there and is giving us permission, or we need to set the rules of engagement when it involves a child. So what we talked about is like, we had a group of reporters that says we should not talk to teachers. We should avoid talking to families. And so we had a pretty robust discussion, and it was like, we have to talk to teachers because there's surviving teachers. There's teachers who know what the flaws are. In fact, one of the best interviews we got was Ryan Atullo, happened to be there, again, being on the ground. There was a lady listening to a press conference from the Department of Public Safety, and he asked her, "You look like you're a teacher here." And she gave him an extraordinary interview about being in the classroom with her students and making sure that they're quiet and hiding. And she's looking on in mute horror because she didn't lock her door. And she's paralyzed about going over there and making a sound. Could the gunman come in there and do what he did? But going back to it's a complexity. It has to do with trying to talk to a child and bringing back a traumatic experience and harm. Not to say that we didn't talk to children, because we did. We talked to witnesses. We talked to teachers. Over the course of my career, we've done interviews with children. But they've been with a parent, and with the approval of the parent. One of the greatest interviews my colleague Audra Birch, who's now at the New York Times, did about a child who was sitting on a stoop and watched another child got shot dead. And Audra worked with the family not to intrude. I want to be able to tell the story, and in the words of a child describing its innocence lost. The child next to me shot dead. So this is the, think about, I don't want to be dire at all because I'm upbeat on things overall, but think about the coverage now of students and children. Going back to Uvalde, when we were having these discussions, one of our colleagues, Sarah, said, "I have grown up in a world where, since I can remember, we practice drills about not getting shot. Keep quiet, get down, go in the closet." And they had like hand signals and so forth. And so she was very emotional about it. So think about, in this world of journalism, how we're covering schools and we're covering children. This is what they've grown up. In this world of survival mode. Welcome to class, this is your teacher. These are going to be your lessons. Now we're going to practice these drills. There's supposed to be safety at home, and there's supposed to be safety with your teacher. There's two areas that should be sacrosanct and non-negotiable. But in many ways, schools have become, there's risks.
Let me ask you about how you assessed the impact on your journalists. Did you have to seek any outside help or support for the people who were on the front lines and saw what they saw?
Yes, so I always make it a point, I always ask our editors and many of our staffers, how are you doing? Regardless of Uvalde, how are you doing? How's it going? Remember, you never walk alone. You know, whatever you need, we got a support network. You don't have to talk to me, but we do. Iron sharpens iron. I've got a newsroom that's very vocal, and not Luz Moreno Lozano, who I adore. Luz came back, and several others says, we need help here. People are hurting. They're really hurting and struggling. And so I grew up at a time, and this is not an excuse, where it's like, you just get it done. You get it done, and you deal with your stuff. And that's the reason since 2020 I've been in therapy. It's clear to me now that I've been suffering from PTSD. I've had recurring nightmares and replaying murders that I've covered, children that have died, who have died, but I never sought therapy because I'm strong enough to tell a story. Bad. So I ended up calling Al Tompkins at the Poynter Institute. His wife Sydney's a therapist, and I said, Al, I really need your help to come talk to our newsroom. And they came in fairly quickly, and it was a very emotional, cathartic event of just tears, crying, venting, and it was just what was needed. And I was there, and just one of our regional editors, my boss, Ray Rivera, But it's like we didn't have to be. So I want you all to just have your space. But it's needed, and I think it's very important. I was in a panel last year in Austin at UT. There's a paper in Brazil who has a therapist on contract, on staff in the newsroom. And she's there, and she's got a room for folks to discreetly go talk to her as they need help. That's brilliant. And I think that is needed. So what we did was, because I've covered enough for these, but beyond that, just the day-to-day pressures of journalism. Then you throw Uvalde in there. And so it's that impact and the loss of children. And then again, journalists now are thrown into stories that no one would have let me in for the first 3 years. I mean, it's like mass shootings. You got interns covering, and I don't think, and please tell me, I just don't think they're really teaching this in journalism schools, or if they are, how to cover mass shootings, the trauma. The other thing that I think is desperately needed, the training in universities, is covering social harassment, threats, and doxing. And that's really necessary because we're seeing a lot of that. But that's off topic. But Rachel, I think to your point, it's just the importance of having an outlet, therapy, a voice for those, because everyone, ultimately what they care about is doing the right thing, but realizing the impact on children.
I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to tell us about how you made the decision to release the video from inside the school. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Let me tell you, once again, if you're on a big story and you have the opportunity to get photos or video, grab that first. Grab that first. Write this down. Look, Pulitzer Prize, Patrick Farrell, the Miami Herald. Pulitzer Prize, Patrick Farrell, the Miami Herald. Look up his photos from Haiti. There was accompanying tremendous coverage out of a flood in Haiti that killed children. Look at those photos. When those photos ran, extraordinary amount of aid came into Haiti just for those photos. So here's the lead-in. Within a short of what you had from day one was a false narrative of police heroics. In fact, if you read the Statesman, there's a story that we just call a big lie, which is what you had the governor talking about heroics. You had Homeland Security, hero law enforcement, police unions, hero law enforcement, state police, local police, heroic actions. If it wasn't for heroic actions, more children would have died. Once you have that tidal wave of that out there, it's very hard to pull it back. So even though a couple of days later, the head of the Department of Public Safety went out there and says, this was a failing, there was a failing, it should have been done more. Think about those words. How many of you have seen the video? All of you have seen of the Uvalde video? Think about saying this was a catastrophic failure versus seeing cops standing in a hallway, not moving, one's using hand sanitizer. A couple of them are hitting each other, firing themselves up, I guess, but not going in. So we knew that at some point that we were going to get the video. To fast forward, so among the things we needed to do is what I talked about earlier: slow down, take a deep breath. Who needs to be in the conversation? Our lawyers understand the shield law in Texas, because there's a prosecutor who talked about she didn't want anything released. What kind of protections are we going to have for a journalist? A, are we willing to go to jail to tell the story? B, yeah. C, what kind of repercussions will this have by publishing the video? And so once we got it, there was a small group of us that just watched it from start to finish. The decision we made was to run a small version for those who don't want to sit through it. And then we're partners with KVU, one of the technical stations in Austin. So we decided to publish it in its entirety. The reason being is because you've got so many conspiracy theorists. This was out, this was cut out, this was cut out. Did you notice this? Did you notice that? So here it's going to publish in its entirety. What we removed, what our managing editor, Courtney Sebesta, said early on at the start, says we cannot have the voices of children screaming. And there. Because if you're a family, you're going to think my child. So then there's part balancing. Can you reach out and talk to all the families? What versus you can't hold this because this is going to tell exactly what happened and how big the failure was. So working with KVU and we tried to see how many families we could talk to. It was impossible. And so we published it, and the reaction, you saw what it was. The video did not lie. The guy goes in there. There's a little boy who came out of the bathroom. If he would have come out earlier, he would have been dead. He walks towards the door. He points at the door, and he opens fire. And you hear the children screaming. And he goes in there, and he shoots again, and he shoots again. So when the state puts out its report, releases it, there's no sound. It only starts when he goes into the classroom, if I remember. So why is having the sound critically important? Because if you've watched the video, there's an initial group of officers who try to go in there, and there's the gunman shoots in the classroom, and they retreat. About 44 minutes later, there's a lot of cops in the hallway. You hear more gunfire. You hear gunfire. No one goes in. It's only 77 minutes later that they decide they go in. So if you sat through that video, you saw exactly, it's what I call, it's the biggest, it's not just me who's saying it, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest failure in law enforcement ever. I've talked to folks who ran SWAT commanders, people who train in SWAT, who do this every day. You name it, from the FBI, state law enforcement, and they all say they're aghast. They've never seen anything like this in their lives. That this, I mean, you got to run to the gunfire. So then there was a lot of great work, and there was also a lot of hurt from the families who saying, how could you do this? We should have had a chance to see it first. Understand that there was a fairly large group of folks who had seen the video, and there was a lot of worry that this was going to be sanitized. And so we made the decision, okay, are we being used, and how do we do this? But that's where we step back, and as leaders, this is from the top leaders of the organization, of our company, everybody looked at it and we made the decision, this is a public service that must be shown. And as time passed, that's what's played out as life. Because it totally counteracted that narrative I told you about the big lie. Because that was the initial heroic actions, and subsequently you've seen everything has been corroborated, just how bad the failing was. And even as more reports keep coming out, officers resign, one guy fired. So
I want to open this up soon to let the journalists join in this conversation, but one more question that I have, and hanging it on that term public service. What have you learned or extracted from going through this harrowing experience with your newsroom, with your journalists, in terms of how can we provide more of a public service to children and families and communities when we have children who are raised with daily fire drill or shooter drills, and we have families that are dealing with employment and all sorts of issues that families, particularly in an area like South Texas, are dealing with. How did Uvalde change your perception of what good coverage of children and families might be?
Well, I will say I've got an extraordinary newsroom. I mean, I'd go to war with them any day of the week and sleep like a baby. It's just an extraordinary, talented group. And in a moment of crisis, they're there. It's what we're doing now, just in our education coverage, whether it's our K through 12 reporter Carrie Heath, Megan Menchaca, who covers higher education, University of Texas, is tell the stories through the eyes of the stakeholders. It's who are going to be the stakeholders. It's going to be the children. It's going to be the students. It's going to be their support network, their parents, teachers who are trying to, they have to be protectors, they have to be teachers, they have to be counselors. So really, it's taking it back to, like, if you're doing, it's the common denominator of what is a story. And what our folks do is, like, it's all about the children. The story, it's all about the children, it's about the students, and it's about the parents. And find the good stories, give them the time. And I know we have to produce stories, but just, although we'll give people the opportunity, like Megan just did this whole series on affordability at Texas. But to your point, and for you all, when you go back, whether you're covering immigration, it's just, who are the stakeholders mostly impacted? The fact that you're here in McAllen is very important, because what you're seeing here is, this is a community where folks live in two worlds, and I can very much relate to it here. There's English, there's Spanish, there's what you do at home, there's what you do at school. So you're really straddling a fence that in many ways, especially for children, you're trying to find your identity. Am I more American? Am I more, what are my roots? Mexican, Central American, and so forth. But everything I'm telling you here is happening in all communities in the country. We're an extraordinarily diverse nation, and you find these subgroups, and they exist. And especially, this is why it's critical, through your immigration coverage and your education coverage, or when you're covering families, of navigating identity and a future in this world, especially in a place like here where there's such poverty. There's a term that I learned in therapy that I'm seeing, and this plays out in immigrant families. It's called the parentified child. And the parentified child is me at age 7, answering the phone and handling rent for my family, dealing with medical appointments, because someone would call, my grandfather would pick up the phone and say, all he could say was, "1 moment," and hand me the phone. And I spoke. And so from age 7, I had to be a responsible adult in a house. So think about your communities. Think about here. I was in baggage claim, and there was families, and you'd see children, and since I'm a parentified child, you can tell. So over the next couple of days, and when you have the sister talking about, it's the impact on children, but through her life experience, where else do you see this? You're going to go back, whether you go back to Austin or where you go back to Houston, it's everywhere, or Minneapolis, it's everywhere. You have those communities, and you may not necessarily, it helps if you speak the language, but if you're showing an earnest interest in covering them and investing your time and heart, folks will open up to you because they're looking for hope. And it's the hope that you'll provide because they want to have a voice too.
Beautifully stated, particularly when it comes to providing the context that people need to understand what children are going through. Let me open it up here right now. Do any of you have any questions for Manny? And introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Maria Garcia with WNIJ. How did you, I wonder what kind of feedback or how did your reporters gain trust so quickly when they were on the ground to tell the story? How did
In Uvalde?
guiding principle in terms of, right, anything that you felt, I just imagine how to put
Maria, it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming. If a reporter was seen talking to folks would just pour in. Now, one of the advantages, again, I'm not going to be critical of what networks or television does, but they have fixers who go there, run around, and they'll grab somebody and they'll bring them over for the anchors, for the talent to do the interviews. So it's an overwhelming amount of people, which creates even more trauma. So for us, it was very, very difficult because in some instances we would get to a house, whether it was a witness, somebody who was where the shooter lived, and says, I'm exhausted, I've talked to 5 people today. So then it became, we got to get there early. So finding hotel rooms, which is very difficult, folks had to stay 30, 40 miles away. We had some people sitting in San Antonio and driving to Uvalde, which is not like going from here to the airport. So it was gaining trust was very difficult, even with the language. The language helped, but at some point, family was like, "I just leave us alone." And then after the video published, there's families who will say that they'll never talk to us. You have some families who'll say, "I'll talk to you, but on background, and I'll give you information, but I don't want to anger the families who are hurt, who don't want to talk to you." And we have some who says, "I'm glad you published, and we'll talk." Now, they've been quoted in our stories. And there's a good group of activists. The other thing that you do is, as you're trying to build relationships, if you can't make that direct connection, and you all know this as journalists, who are folks who could be advocates for you and help you in a community? And that actually we've had a couple of activists who've been able to open doors with us. One thing that really did well for us, again, just because somebody says something they're not right. When the state released its final report with the video I was telling you that was sanitized, understanding the community. So some families said, "Is this report in Spanish? Because my relative doesn't speak Spanish. They don't read English, they don't speak English." And then they threw off the cuff, "Well, it's going to take 2 weeks to translate this or longer, and we're working on it," which is not true. I think it was Luz who was there, a reporter, when the question about, "Is this report in Spanish?" And the person who was part of this committee, went like this. But then, don't buy this thing, impeach him. I think it was longer. So it's going to take us at least 2 weeks to translate into this, or maybe longer. I was watching the press conference when he said that. It says, "No, man, I can do this in, no." So I texted. So this was I've got a copy of it here. This was a real international thing. So I texted Teresa Fontalo, who was managing editor of Novo Herald, who translates. She's Venezuelan. I reached out to Romina, who works for USA Today. She's Colombian. We found another translator and copy editor who's in El DF, Mexico City, and because we wanted to have the nuance in the report. So we grabbed the report that supposedly was going to take 2+ weeks to translate it, and we had it done, and then we have Spanish speakers within USA Today. So we translated it, copy edited it, and then Nicole Carroll, so the small thinking editor, Manny García, I'm there looking for Kinko's and FedEx places and copy places in Uvalde to translate a couple of hundred copies. Nicole Carroll, the editor of USA Today, says, Manny, we own printing presses. So she ran, we ran 10,000 copies in Corpus Christi where our printing is. So by Wednesday, it was done. So the report comes out Sunday. We actually had it by Tuesday, but we wanted to really go through it, line by line, footnotes and everything. And we had it translated Wednesday, and a truck delivered it Thursday to Uvalde, and we distributed the copies all over the churches, city, funeral homes, everywhere where the families were, to the advocates. And so this is it here. This is the actual, that's the entire report. That could not have been done. It was going to take several weeks or more, and it can't be done. It was in the hands of residents. The entire thing's in Spanish, translated on Thursday. No, delivered on Thursday. Thank you. And we have the names of the photos and the names of the children on the back. And so again, this is part of building trust in the community. But for you all, again, if somebody tells you they can't, of course, we came under attack by that, by the legislators who said that this was, that we didn't use professional translators and we didn't use a translation service. So this is just yellow journalism trying to get ahead and hurting the families again. And we just we did the right thing.
Any other questions before I jump in with one? And that is about this issue of advocacy, or what is perceived sometimes as advocacy. Often journalists with lived experience, and you have some of the most powerful lived experience in this topic that a journalist could have, being that parentified child. But sometimes when journalists care too deeply about these issues, they're sort of warned back. You're too close to it, or we're not advocates, we're just telling the story. So how do you balance that when it comes to providing service, a public service, hope to communities when it comes to their children?
Well, I say this as someone who's been pulled off stories, or just you're too close to it because you're Cuban, or this has happened, or listen, just that's because of what's happening here. Look, I don't look at it as advocacy journalism. I look at it as life experience. And if somebody's got a life experience and a knowledge and an expertise, you put them on that story. Then what you do is, it's editing. If you see wait a minute, you got opinion in here, let's talk about this. I want to make sure, but you can, advocacy, you could make the case that investigative reporting in many ways is advocacy journalism. You've decided that somebody's done something wrong, and they've done something wrong. If they prove you differently, absolutely, you say that, but you can make that case. My view's always been, if a journalist has got an understanding and a way of viewing things, and that's their lived life experience, why not have them on their story? Because they're going to tell this through a lens that's got a credibility and a voice that otherwise it would be very, very hard to find. Where you work on it together is through the trusting that you have to develop through the editing process and the collaborative process. But I understand I hear the point, but for me is like put the best reporter who's got the best knowledge and experience on the story and let him look at Jerry Mitchell. How many of you know the work of Jerry Mitchell, who worked at the Clarion Ledger? So Jerry Mitchell has solved civil rights killings. He's incredible.
Didn't he work on the
Medgar Evers?
Yes, Medgar Evers.
Birmingham, the church bombing in Birmingham, Medgar Evers. He interviewed the guy who ultimately did it, sent them back. The feds knew who killed Medgar Evers. So Jerry went and interviewed the guy. The guy went to prison. But so Jerry, you could say, oh, he's an advocate because he's just focusing on solving civil rights murders. Well, the problem is he's got an expertise, he's got a heart for this, and he's got enthusiasm, and he thinks critically, so he's on it. So I understand, but for me, it's like put the best reporter with the biggest heart on the story and just run.
Got a question over here.
Megan Mangrum from the Dallas Morning News. It's going off of that topic. Do you have tips for how to get readers or our audience to care when it has to do with something that, like, I might worry that I am advocating, but it's something that I think on the children's beat especially, there's certain things that are still up for debate that shouldn't be in society, and maybe that's just me speaking, but I can think of in a town in Tennessee in 2018 when school board members released a press release that they didn't think segregation in schools was a problem. Not that they didn't believe that it was happening, they just didn't care. And having a conversation with editors who were like, well, some of our readers also don't think it's a problem, so it's, we don't want to piss them off. So how, when you're like, have topics like that, I think of some, like, obviously the failure in Uvalde, like, people should care about that. But when it's values that are up for debate, whether or not they should be, like, how do we convince our readers, like, no, we're not advocating, like, this is just how it should be?
So I don't think it has to fall all on you, because you're part of a news organization with an extraordinary editor in Catrice Hardy. So frankly, one of the best ideas I've heard when I've been here is what the Christian Science Monitor does, this thing about, right, why are we doing this story? Little box, why we're writing the story. It's almost like pulling a nut graph and putting in there, we're doing this because this is the reason we're doing it. So I don't think it's just on you. You have to tell those stories. Part of your nut graph is why this is important. But your journalism is part of a bigger part of the morning news that, let's say, if you have time to go speak to community groups, that's another thing as we're coming out of COVID. The best thing that we can do, because you're not just journalists, you're ambassadors. And it's not just ambassador to whoever you're interviewing for a story. I will tell you, readers and non-readers can't get enough of having journalists come talk to their breakfast or lunch groups and so forth. They love it. So it's part of the job for all of us, is like, this is why this story matters, which is your nut graph, through your editorial board, weighing in on it, this is why this matters. Or if you disagree, you think this doesn't matter, let's have a conversation. One of the best journalists in this country who's really connected bridges between groups or seeing things polar opposite is David Plazas at the Tennessean, who's created this Tennessee Voices. He leads the editorial board, and so he's brought in, let's say, progressives and conservatives, because there's one thing that everybody agrees on. They want a better Tennessee for their children or grandchildren. So it's like, where do we find the middle ground? So you have to, in your case, you have to continue, you have to continue doing your story. And if you feel I'm beating my head against the wall because no one's reading them, but as we talked about when we were outside, also remember part of your job with the enterprise stories you do, the investigative or even your reporting work, It's part of the historical record. It's part of a historical record. The coverage that the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel does on the denial of January 6th and all the demagoguery and everything behind that, that's part of a historical record. If voters choose another way, yeah, I want Johnson to go back or whoever, you do your story because you're laying, this is what the reality and truth is. So I have, but I'm not gonna dance around because I have reporters who come to me and say, I wrote an extraordinary story, only got 700 page views, and it's going to have impact, and it didn't get any subscriptions. I said, yeah, but you have a public service work here. There's a lot of things you can do with headlines and SEO, but what I'll tell all of you is control what you can control. And that's a story that you feel you need to tell. And I'm quoting an editor who told me this years ago. For context, in the midst of layoffs, when I was having a panic attack way back being a reporter, he says, Manny, what do you have control over? He says, well, the stories I'm doing, never forget that. And who are you doing it for? Our readers. Never forget that, the story and your readers.
Are there any other questions? Did you have one more? Grab them.
And you talk about context and, experience. People, I'm from Chicago, so there, we may, I think that the Latino experience here in Texas is very distinct and I'd say different compared to other places, right? So, I wonder in terms of like racism or discrimination, in terms of how this was treated, how the Uvalde, police reacted, if that was part of, if that was part of how that was covered, if in the fact that that these were Latino children and kind of if that had any, how was it handled? Or even asking the question is I'm having a hard time, but I just wonder how that.
No, I think so. Let me tell you. One thing I forgot to say. So when those 10,000 newspapers were delivered, we actually arranged. They were delivered to the Uvalde Police Department because they had a safe place. And so a bunch of us drove down there to pick them up, and the guy who met me at the door to let me inside, he was one of the officers on the video. And they're like zombies. They live in this community. They've raised families in these communities, and they're destroyed. And so I don't think it's something about. I just think it's one of these. It's lack of training, or I don't think it's a racism or an ethnic thing. It's just it's an epic failure, and now they're living with it. Because we were in the police department talking to them. The interim chief came out, and you couldn't, your heart, because they have to live with this. We interviewed a long time. We interviewed a commander who'd been through Quantico, and he said this is among the biggest tragedies to continue beyond the loss of life of these beautiful children is the officers who are going to have to live forever knowing that they didn't go in there.
Hi, Aja Sid from Word in Black. You just made me think of, like, in your experience, what do you think is the difference between the way America addresses the future of the American child and their well-being in comparison to other countries? Why our children continuously go through these tragedies, both large and small, inside and outside of the school environment? What sets us apart from all these other countries that continuously allows this to keep happening?
And I don't say this as a political statement at all, but it's just, that's the ease with which you've seen these shooters can get guns. I go back to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Nicholas Cruz. There was a gun thing there, and he was a walking red flag. But in that case, you had an intelligence failure because the FBI knew. They had been warned that this guy was a problem going forward. In Uvalde, the ease, in Sandy Hook, the ease of getting a weapon, and you see in Texas, there's going to be very little movement going forward. The family has met with Senator Cruz and others. There's no momentum for that. And so you can fortify schools all you want, put metal detectors, try to assign a SWAT officer outside, but it's the proliferation of weapons. You've seen stories which, again, goes back to the way covering children today, how different it is in many ways. There is parents who have bought these survival packs in case you get shot, how to tie a tourniquet so you don't bleed out from a femoral hit, or just you have that. So that's today, but it is today. So that's the only answer I have for you. And so I've talked about this with my mom, and she's a retired adolescent psychiatrist, and she also says a lot of it has to do with your home life, how you're raised. So a lot of it is home. So how do we cover? Is there like the dynamics of families trying to navigate the world today? This is why I talked about telling the stories through the lens of like what's working in a school, what's working here, what's some advice for parents. It's like the consumer work that TV does. But being a parent it's always been hard because there's no manual for it.
If there aren't any, one more.
Adam Eckelman, the Modesto Bee. You mentioned in the Uvalde case where you had to talk to reporters and kind of decide in certain cases not to speak to a family, to give somebody space, maybe a victim, a child, a teacher, etc. I'm interested in the opposite case, where a reporter does get an interview, and the person they interview, it's on the record. There's a presumption in here that it's on the record, and you decide afterwards not to use that because you feel that the child or the parent didn't have informed consent. It's something I feel like I often encounter when covering children and families, is trying to make sure that they have an informed consent in that conversation, that they understand how it's being used. So in Uvalde or elsewhere, have there been cases where you've had to kind of question whether it's fair to that family to use content that was, rightfully reported?
Yeah, correct. So in the Uvalde cases, what interviews do we have? Have we talked to a family member? What do we have? Because I will tell you, during the course of my career as an editor, I've pulled interviews where the reporter has gotten a great interview. Was a parent there? No. Says, okay, man, we got to try to get a family member here, because imagine if the parent picks up their paper or goes on the website and they see this interview and they didn't consent to a child doing this. And it's tough, but I've talked to the reporter, and when we've talked it through, this is the reason why this is important, to be able to do that. And but there's cases when it doesn't happen, but I will say always err on the side of caution, because you will always have a tomorrow to come back to that story. And not that we get it right all the time, but always I said, slow down. But that's, again, my thing is like we want to make sure that we're talking to family members. But it also goes, if you're covering, I'll tell you this on immigration matters, How many of us have interviewed folks that clearly we believe they don't have the sophistication to really understand that they're talking to a reporter, or they feel they're talking to a reporter, but they don't understand what they're saying, or just maybe not, and you have that doubt, so that they may be an adult. So again, I'm trusting you. So we're the newsroom. I'm the editor. I'm not going to micromanage all of you here in our butt-kicking newsroom that we have right now here, all of us in here, but I'm trusting you to use discernment and good judgment.
I think, we could keep you here all night, but I think I have a question that will help wrap this all up completely. And that is, I woke up this morning and there was a story that said the 6-year-old who shot the teacher. There had been other warning signs. He at one point said he wanted to light her on fire and watch her die or something, whatever. So we always get the horror behind these stories. We always hear what goes wrong. Will we ever see a day when there's a front page story that says, here's how the system failed this child and his family, here's what interventions might have worked, here's what to do if you see a kid in trouble, how can you as a community support him? Will that ever be a front page or newsworthy kind of content?
Absolutely it will. And so always, the other thing, I want to leave you with a couple of things, but always remember this, a reporter's best friend is time. The story may not come today or tomorrow, but maybe it's going to be there in 6 months. To your point, what Rachel's bringing, so this is a story, because think about the hurdles here with the 6-year-old. You're trying to find out the family dynamics, and I haven't been that close to it. How did this happen? Then you have all kinds of privacy issues. Could the family have had some, run-ins with the state, foster care? Was there anything in play that maybe they're going to cite confidentiality? So there's a lot of hurdles, but our job as journalists is to knock down those hurdles. That's something that people will want to read that in a year from now or 6 months from now. How did the 6-year-old end up in the class and say, I want to shoot you? A 6-year-old. So, and you don't have to, when you see those stories, do what a colleague of mine used to do. He kept himself like an Excel spreadsheet, and he used to put like these little nuggets for stories to come back to. So put those in your back pocket. So I think so. I want to tell you this one story that really resonated, and then I've got a last point. And you tell me when to shut up. No, but one day I was a general assignment reporter, and something fell off the page, and my editor said, this fell off the page, we need a story, and we need a centerpiece now. You got to go find it. I'm like, well, I don't want to hear, you go find it. So you never want to be that reporter who tells your editor, no one's talking to me, no one's calling me back, and I can't get the story. Really? So I called some cops, man, I need this thing, man, I'm dying on a vine here. My editor says, bro, I got a great story for you, man. We're about to give a bicycle to this little girl. It's a great friggin' story. The cops were chasing this guy down the street. He drops his friggin' radio. The radio's like $1,000, and we're like, and if you lose your radio, you gotta pay for it. And this little girl, she was in elementary school at Ada Merritt. I'll never forget that. She finds the radio, and so the cops go to her, and she said, "Here's your radio." And says, "Why are you so sad?" And it was like, "Somebody stole my bicycle." And so these cops, so this is like a big SWAT unit. They're like this. He goes, "Don't worry, baby, we got you covered." So they go to the guy says, "We're going to give this little bike to this little girl. It's going to be this big event. She doesn't friggin' know. You want to come along?" So I'm calling a photographer. So we haul over there, And there's these guys, they get out of this big truck and they got this bicycle, and in fact, they went to the bike store and they're like, no, we want all the little pink ribbons on it and put the seat and do this. No, I can't do her name. No, you're gonna put her effing name on it now. And so they take the bike over there and they deliver the bike to her. She's like, it's this big thing because she was honest enough and she returned the police radio. In fact, the guy who lost the radio gave her the bike. And there's one even little better note to that. There's like a local little drug dealer neighborhood boss guy there. So the cops go to him and says, you're now in charge to make sure her bike's stolen. You're gonna make sure her bike never goes away, and it's on you. If her bike goes away, you're responsible. And so I write the story, that we run it at the centerpiece, not on 1A in the metro section. The next day, she's a hero in her school. So they pull her out of class, they do this incredible announcement, and they're parading the paper about honesty, the story about honesty, doing the right thing in her pink bike. And she was like in first or second grade. So there's those stories out there. They exist, it's just a matter of finding them. So it's not all doom and gloom. So I want to leave you with that. And then the other thing, when you think about, man, my newsroom's not big enough, man, gosh, we're so small. I remember we used to be 400. Look up Daniel Gilbert and Pulitzer Prize. Daniel Gilbert, Pulitzer Prize, not just Pulitzer Prize, public safety. In 2010, the newsroom, barely 7 people. Daniel's covering what? GA, education, and he gets a tip about these natural gas leases, something in Virginia where residents are getting screwed. So he's doing his school board stuff, he's doing his Saturday GA, his boss scrounges money to send him to IRE to go to a boot camp to learn Excel. The guy does his story, blows the entire state of Virginia up over these gas leases, and guess what? A newsroom of 7 people with a guy doing 3 beats wins the Pulitzer Prize in public safety. And who does he beat? The Asbury Park Press, with its storied investigations unit on these real estate taxes, and a partnership of the LA Times and ProPublica. One guy, like 3 beats, in a newsroom with 7 cats. Trust me, you can do it. You can do it, because I know, I was a judge on that Pulitzer board. I read his stuff and going, this guy's a friggin' beast. In fact, I tried to hire him, but he went to the Wall Street Journal. So, listen, don't give up, and don't buy into. How many of you saw the movie Seabiscuit? Okay, you ever see how racehorses run? How they got blinders on? There is a reason they run with blinders, and it's because they're focused on the prize, and it's the finish line. What I want to share is that treat yourself. If there's negative people around you looking to weigh you down, avoid those. Iron sharpens iron. Surround yourself with people who want to be victorious. This is why this is important, because all of you were away for 3 days. Use yourself to lift each other up and focus on success and your prize, because frankly, I shouldn't be here. You know, I'm the child of Cuban refugees who lost it all. You know, and then here I am, editor of the year. You know, that's like a God thing. And because what I tried to do is like doing the right thing and focusing on the stories. And I don't have some superpower that you don't. All of you are here for a reason. There's no accident. There are no accidents. All of you are here to do the great work and support each other.
I neglected to mention earlier that the National Press Foundation has named Manny García as the Benjamin C. Bradley Editor of the Year, and he'll be in Washington, D.C. next month to receive his award during our annual dinner. But I think you can see from tonight why he got that award. and why we are so grateful that you've joined us to start this conference. So thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
with us.